The morning mist clung to the battlements of Ravenshollow Castle like a shroud, but it could not muffle the harsh voice that echoed across the training yard. Sir Gareth de Montclair stood tall in his mail hauberk, his weathered face twisted into its usual scowl as he surveyed the line of young men before him. These were his squires, boys ranging from 14 to 17 years of age, each one the son of a minor lord or wealthy merchant seeking to earn his spurs through service to the notorious knight. "You call that sword work?" Sir Gareth's voice cracked like a whip across the courtyard. He strode toward young Edmund of Wessex, who had just completed a series of practice strikes against a straw quintain. The boy's technique was adequate, but Sir Gareth had never been known for his patience or encouragement. Without warning, the knight's gauntleted hand struck Edmund across the face, sending the boy stumbling backward. "A blacksmith's apprentice swings a hammer with more grace than you wield that blade, boy." The other squires stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the ground. They had all endured similar treatment over the months of their service. There was Thomas of Kent, whose father had paid handsomely for his placement under Sir Gareth's tutelage. The boy bore fresh bruises on his arms from yesterday's lesson in proper armour maintenance. Beside him stood William the Younger, son of a prosperous wool merchant, who still limped slightly from when Sir Gareth had kicked him down for dropping a piece of tack. But it was Aldric of Blackmoor who watched with the most intensity. At 16, he was neither the youngest nor the oldest of the squires, but there was something different about him. His dark eyes held a spark that the others had lost weeks ago. Where they had learned to cower and accept their daily humiliations, Aldric's jaw remained set, his shoulders squared, even as he witnessed his fellow squires suffer. Sir Gareth had noticed this defiance, and it infuriated him. The knight had served in the Welsh campaigns under King Edward's father, had seen blood and death, had earned his reputation through brutality on the battlefield. He believed that only through harsh treatment could these soft lordlings be forged into proper warriors. In his mind, breaking their spirits was the first step in building them anew. "Aldric," Sir Gareth barked, his pale eyes fixing on the dark-haired youth. "Since you seem so interested in Edmund's failures, perhaps you would care to demonstrate the proper form." Aldric stepped forward without hesitation, his hand moving smoothly to the grip of his practiced sword. Unlike the others, he did not flinch or show fear. This only served to anger Sir Gareth further. "Strike the quintain," the knight commanded, gesturing toward the rotating wooden target with its shield and sandbag counterweight. Aldric approached the target with measured steps, his movements fluid and controlled. He had been training since childhood under his father's master-at-arms, and his natural ability was evident in every motion. He drew back his sword and struck the shield with perfect technique, spinning away, just as the sandbag swung around to where his head had been moments before. The strike was flawless, executed with the precision of a seasoned warrior. The other squires exchanged glances, knowing that Sir Gareth would find fault regardless of the performance. They were not disappointed. "Adequate," Sir Gareth said with a sneer, though his eyes betrayed his irritation at being unable to find genuine fault with the technique. "But your stance betrays arrogance, boy. You think yourself better than your fellows." Aldric met the knight's gaze steadily. "I think myself ready to learn, my lord, as are we all." The words were respectful enough, but the tone carried an undercurrent that made Sir Gareth's face flush with anger. Here was a boy who refused to be broken, who dared to maintain his dignity even in the face of deliberate humiliation. It was a challenge the knight could not ignore. "Ready to learn," Sir Gareth repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Then learn this, whelp." The knight's mailed fist caught Aldric across the jaw with shocking force, sending the young man sprawling in the mud of the training yard. The other squires gasped, but none dared to move or speak. Sir Gareth stood over Aldric's prone form, his chest heaving with barely contained rage. "When I speak, you listen. When I command, you obey. When I strike you down, you thank me for the lesson and beg for another." The knight's voice carried across the suddenly silent courtyard. "That is how you will learn humility, boy. That is how you will learn your place." Aldric slowly pushed himself up from the mud, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. But his eyes never left Sir Gareth's face, and in them burned a fire that would not be easily extinguished. The bells of Ravenscroft's chapel rang for the midday meal, but Sir Gareth showed no intention of ending the training session. The 3 squires had been drilling for nearly 6 hours, their tunics soaked with sweat despite the cool autumn air. Their arms ached from wielding the heavy practice swords, and their legs trembled from countless lunges and defensive stances. Did I give you permission to rest? Sir Gareth roared when he noticed Thomas leaning on his sword. The knight's face had grown red with fury, and spittle flew from his lips as he spoke. You will continue until I am satisfied with your performance, and at this rate, that may be well past compline. Edmund wiped the sweat from his brow and exchanged a meaningful glance with William. They had served under Sir Gareth for 2 years now, and they had never seen him in such a state. Usually, his cruelty had purpose behind it, harsh lessons designed to forge them into warriors, but today felt different, as if some inner demon had taken hold of their master. The other knights in the courtyard had long since dismissed their own squires for the meal. Sir Baldwin, Sir Gareth's closest neighbour, paused near the training area and frowned at the continued drilling. "Gareth," he called out, "perhaps the boys could use some sustenance before continuing their training." Sir Gareth whirled around, his hand instinctively moving to the pommel of his sword. "Sir Baldwin, I would thank you to mind your own affairs. These whelps will eat when they have earned the privilege through proper sword work." The older knight raised his hands in a gesture of peace and walked away, but not before giving the 3 squires a look of sympathy. Edmund caught that look and felt a spark of hope. Perhaps not all knights had forgotten the virtues of mercy and restraint that the code of chivalry demanded. "Back to your drills," Sir Gareth commanded, turning his attention once more to his charges. "Edmund, your footwork is still clumsy. Perhaps a few hours of practicing lunges while carrying stones will improve your balance." He gestured to a pile of building stones near the castle wall, each weighing perhaps 20 pounds. Edmund's jaw tightened, but he moved to collect the stones as ordered. The added weight made the sword exercises nearly impossible, and within minutes he was struggling to maintain even basic forms. William, watching his friend suffer, felt anger building in his chest. At 14, he was the youngest and smallest of the 3, but his father had raised him to understand the difference between discipline and cruelty. "Sir Gareth," he said carefully, "perhaps Edmund could benefit from observing proper technique first, before practicing with the stones." The silence that followed was deafening. Sir Gareth slowly turned his gaze upon William, and the young squire immediately realised his mistake. No squire questioned a knight's methods, regardless of how harsh they might seem. The rigid hierarchy of feudal society demanded absolute obedience from those of lower station. "Did you just presume to instruct me, boy?" Sir Gareth's voice was dangerously quiet now, more threatening than his earlier shouting. "Perhaps you believe your noble blood makes you my equal in matters of warfare and training." William's face paled, but he stood his ground. "No, Sir Gareth, I merely thought—" "You thought?" Sir Gareth interrupted with a bitter laugh. "Squires are not paid to think. You are here to obey, to learn through suffering as I learned, as every worthy knight has learned since time immemorial." The knight strode toward William with predatory grace, his spurs jingling against the stone courtyard. "Since you seem so concerned with Edmund's training, perhaps you would like to join him in carrying stones. In fact, I think all 3 of you could benefit from this exercise." Thomas and Edmund looked at William with a mixture of gratitude and concern. The youngest squire had spoken for all of them, but now all would pay the price for his boldness. As they moved to collect the heavy stones, each squire wondered how much more they could endure. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as the 3 young men continued their sword drills, while burdened with the additional weight. Their movements became increasingly desperate, their forms deteriorating with exhaustion. Yet Sir Gareth showed no sign of relenting, his demands growing more unreasonable with each passing hour. In the shadows of the castle wall, other servants and pages watched the brutal training session with growing unease, sensing that something fundamental was about to change at Ravenshollow Castle. The afternoon shadows grew long across Ravenscroft's courtyard as the brutal training session entered its 8th hour. The 3 squires could barely lift their practice swords, their arms shaking with exhaustion and their legs threatening to buckle under the weight of the stones they still carried. Their faces were streaked with dirt and sweat, and Thomas had begun to sway dangerously with each movement. Sir Gareth paced before them like a caged beast, his own energy seemingly inexhaustible despite the hours of screaming and demonstrating. His mail armor clinked rhythmically as he moved, and his dark eyes burned with an intensity that bordered on madness. The other knights had long since retired to the great hall for their evening meal, leaving only a few curious servants watching from the shadows. "Pathetic," Sir Gareth snarled, striking Thomas across the shoulder with the flat of his sword when the boy stumbled. My destrier shows more grace than you three combined. Perhaps I should stable you with the other beasts, since you cannot conduct yourselves as men." Edmund gritted his teeth and forced himself to continue the drill, though every muscle in his body screamed for mercy. The stones he carried felt like lead weights, and his sword arm had long since gone numb. Beside him, William struggled to maintain his footing, his youthful face pale with exhaustion and determination. "Sir Gareth," Edmund said between laboured breaths, "we have been training since dawn without food or water. Perhaps—" The knight's backhanded blow sent Edmund sprawling to the ground, the stones scattering across the courtyard with loud crashes. Blood trickled from the squire's split lip as he struggled to rise, his training sword lying several feet away where it had fallen from his nerveless grip. "Perhaps what?" Sir Gareth roared, standing over the fallen young man. "Perhaps you think you deserve comfort. Perhaps you believe that warfare will pause for your convenience. I have seen men die because they were too weak to lift their swords when it mattered most." Edmund slowly pushed himself to his hands and knees, his breathing ragged. At 18, he was the oldest of the three squires and had endured Sir Gareth's harsh methods longer than the others. But something had changed in the knight's demeanour over recent months, a darkness that went beyond mere discipline. The code of chivalry spoke of tempering justice with mercy, yet mercy seemed to have fled Ravenshollow Castle entirely. "I have given you everything," Sir Gareth continued, his voice rising to a fever pitch. "My knowledge, my experience, my reputation, and you repay me with weakness and complaints. Your fathers sent me soft boys, and soft boys you remain." As Edmund struggled to his feet, reaching for his fallen sword, Sir Gareth's boot connected with his ribs. The young man cried out in pain and collapsed again, curling into himself as waves of agony washed over him. Thomas and William watched in horror, their own exhaustion forgotten in the face of this escalating brutality. "Get up!" Sir Gareth commanded. But Edmund remained on the ground, struggling to breathe. "I said get up, you worthless cur!" The knight drew back his foot for another kick, but this time Edmund was ready. Years of training had honed his reflexes, and despite his exhaustion and pain, he rolled aside at the last moment. Sir Gareth's boot struck only stone, throwing him slightly off balance. In that instant, Edmund's hand closed around his fallen training sword. Without thinking, driven by pain and desperation, he swept the weapon in a wide arc that caught Sir Gareth behind the knees. The knight stumbled and fell heavily to the courtyard stones, his armour clanking as he hit the ground. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the magnitude of what had just occurred settled over the courtyard. A squire had struck his knight, violating every law of feudal society and the sacred bond between master and student. Thomas and William stood frozen, their faces reflecting the shock and terror they felt. Edmund remained on his knees, the practice sword trembling in his grip as he stared at Sir Gareth's prone form. He had not meant to strike back, had never intended such defiance. But months of humiliation and cruelty had finally found their breaking point, and now there would be consequences beyond anything he could imagine. Sir Gareth slowly pushed himself to his feet, his face a mask of fury that transcended mere anger. His hand moved instinctively to his real sword, the steel blade that had tasted blood in a dozen battles. The look in his eyes spoke of violence that would not stop at mere punishment. The die had been cast, and there could be no returning to the way things were before. The metallic ring of steel being drawn from its scabbard cut through the evening air like a death knell. Sir Gareth's sword, a blade that had served him faithfully through campaigns in France and countless tournaments, gleamed wickedly in the fading light. His face had transformed into something barely human, twisted by rage that bordered on madness. "You dare?" Sir Gareth's voice was barely recognisable, a guttural growl that seemed to emerge from the depths of his soul. "You dare raise a weapon against your sworn lord?" Edmund scrambled backward across the courtyard stones, still clutching his wooden practice sword, though he knew it would be useless against sharpened steel. The reality of his situation crashed down upon him like a falling portcullis. He had committed an act of rebellion that could only be answered with blood. Thomas and William stood paralysed, torn between loyalty to their fellow squire and terror of their master's wrath. The code that governed their lives demanded obedience above all else. Yet they could not simply watch as Edmund faced certain death for a moment of desperate defiance. "Sir Gareth, please," William cried out, his young voice cracking with emotion. Edmund meant no harm. He was merely silence. Sir Gareth roared, whirling toward the youngest squire with his blade raised. You would defend this treachery? Perhaps you all share in his guilt." The knight's eyes had taken on a wild gleam that spoke of a mind pushed beyond reason. Years of accumulated bitterness, disappointment, and violence had finally found their outlet. The harsh lessons he had learned in war, the deaths of comrades, the constant struggle to maintain his position in a world that showed no mercy to the weak, all of it poured forth in a torrent of uncontrolled fury. Edmund used Sir Gareth's momentary distraction to gain his feet and create more distance between them. His ribs ached where the knight's boot had connected, and he could taste blood in his mouth, but adrenaline drove him forward. Around the courtyard, servants and pages began to emerge from doorways and alcoves, drawn by the commotion yet afraid to intervene. "You have forgotten your place," Sir Gareth snarled, advancing on Edmund with predatory grace. "I have given you everything: training, knowledge, the chance to earn your spurs and join the ranks of true warriors. And you repay this generosity by striking your betters like some common brigand." The knight's swordwork was fluid and deadly as he pressed his attack. Each stroke was calculated to wound rather than kill immediately, designed to prolong Edmund's suffering as punishment for his transgression. The wooden practice sword splintered under the impact of the steel blade, leaving Edmund with only a broken hilt. "I have killed better men than you in service to my king." Sir Gareth continued his advance, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier rage. "French knights who died with honor, defending their lands and their faith. Yet here I am, forced to discipline an ungrateful whelp who knows nothing of true hardship." Edmund dodged desperately, using his knowledge of the courtyard's layout to avoid the knight's strikes. But he was exhausted from hours of brutal training, and Sir Gareth was fresh and fueled by righteous anger. It could only be a matter of time before the inevitable conclusion. Thomas made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Seeing his friend in mortal peril, he hefted one of the heavy stones they had been forced to carry and hurled it at Sir Gareth's back. The projectile struck the knight between the shoulder blades, staggering him and buying Edmund precious seconds to escape immediate death. Now Sir Gareth's attention fixed upon Thomas with the intensity of a hunting hawk. "So be it," he whispered, his voice carrying easily across the silent courtyard. "If you wish to join your fellow in rebellion, then you shall share his fate." The situation had spiraled completely beyond control. What had begun as harsh but conventional training had transformed into something far darker. The rigid hierarchy that governed medieval society was crumbling in the face of Sir Gareth's unleashed madness, and blood would inevitably flow before the night was through. In the growing shadows of Ravenshollow Castle, 3 young men faced a choice between submission and survival, while their master had already chosen the path of violence without mercy. The sound of running footsteps on stone echoed through the courtyard as Sir Baldwin and 2 other knights rushed from the great hall, drawn by the sounds of combat. What they witnessed stopped them in their tracks, Sir Gareth, sword in hand, pursuing his own squires with lethal intent, while the young men desperately fought for their lives with whatever weapons they could find. "Gareth, stop this madness," Sir Baldwin commanded, his own blade clearing its sheath. At 60 years of age, he had seen enough warfare to recognize the difference between discipline and butchery. "These are your sworn charges, not enemies on a battlefield." Sir Gareth wheeled around, his face streaked with sweat and twisted by rage. "They have betrayed the sacred trust between knight and squire. They have raised weapons against their rightful lord. The penalty for such treachery is death." But even as he spoke, Sir Gareth's voice carried a note of uncertainty. The presence of his peers forced him to confront the reality of his actions, and some small part of his rational mind began to reassert itself. The code of chivalry that had governed his entire adult life spoke clearly about the protection of those who could not protect themselves. Edmund, Thomas, and William had retreated to the far corner of the courtyard, clutching broken training weapons and stones. Their faces bore the marks of their ordeal: split lips, bruised cheeks, and eyes wide with terror and exhaustion. Yet they stood together, their earlier differences forgotten in the face of shared peril. "Sir Gareth," Edmund said, his voice steady despite his fear, "we have served you faithfully for 2 years. We have endured your discipline because we believed it would make us worthy knights. But what we witnessed today was not the teaching of honor. It was cruelty without purpose." The words hung in the evening air like an accusation, Around the courtyard, servants and pages nodded in silent agreement, having witnessed the day's events from the shadows. Even Sir Gareth's fellow knights exchanged meaningful glances, their expressions suggesting that Edmund's assessment was not without merit. Sir Baldwin stepped forward, placing himself between the knight and his squires. "Gareth, lower your weapon. These boys speak truly. What began as training became something darker. You have allowed your demons to master you, and innocent blood nearly flowed because of it." For a long moment, Sir Gareth stood frozen between rage and reason. His sword trembled in his grip as conflicting emotions warred within him. The memories of fallen comrades, lost battles, and years of accumulated bitterness pressed down upon him like a physical weight. Yet the presence of his peers and the accusation in their eyes forced him to confront the man he had become. "I have given them everything," Sir Gareth said finally, his voice breaking. "My knowledge, my experience, my dedication to their training. I sought only to prepare them for the harsh realities of war and lordship. And in doing so, you became the very thing you sought to protect them from." Sir Baldwin replied gently, "A knight without mercy is no knight at all, but merely a brigand with noble blood." The sword slipped from Sir Gareth's nerveless fingers, clattering to the stone courtyard with a sound like falling thunder. The knight sank to his knees, the weight of his actions finally overwhelming his pride and anger. Around him, the assembled witnesses remained silent, understanding that they had observed the destruction of a man's honour. Edmund stepped forward cautiously, approaching his former master with a mixture of wariness and pity. "Sir Gareth," he said quietly, "we do not seek vengeance, only justice. We ask only to be released from our service and allowed to seek training elsewhere." Sir Baldwin nodded approvingly at the young man's words. "Wisely spoken. Sir Gareth, you will release these squires from their oaths and provide them with letters of recommendation. They have shown more honour in defeat than many knights display in victory." As the full moon rose over Ravenshollow Castle, the three young men gathered their few possessions and prepared to depart. They had learned valuable lessons about courage, loyalty, and the true meaning of honour, though not in the way their master had intended. Sir Gareth remained kneeling in the courtyard long after they had gone, contemplating the price of allowing darkness to consume one's soul. The rebellion of a single squire had exposed the corruption that can grow within even the most honoured institutions, reminding all who witnessed it that true strength comes not from the ability to inflict suffering, but from the wisdom to know when mercy serves justice better than the sword.